Yoshie Shiratori, the convict who escaped prison using a bowl of miso soup. Abashiri Prison in the Hokkaido Prefecture of Japan opened during the Meiji era in 1890. It was one of the new prisons built to accommodate the growing number of criminals following the abolition of the death penalty in 1882. In winter, it's a bitterly cold place, with the local lake freezing over and thick fog regularly engulfing the area. In its entire history, only one man has ever escaped, and that was Yoshie Shiratori. He was born in 1907 in the Aomori Prefecture, which is the northernmost part of the Tohoku region in the land of the rising sun. Shiratori was the product of a broken home and fell into a life of petty crime at a young age. He spent much of his adult life in prison. Between 1933 and 1947, he escaped from prison no less than 4 times, but the one he was most famous for was his escape from Abashiri Prison. It was 1944 and the war was going badly for Japan, while its earlier territorial gains in the conflict were rapidly being retaken by the Allies. And to make matters worse, the Americans had just started its strategic bombing of the Japanese mainland. Shiratori had ended up being transferred to Abashiri as he had escaped from his 2 previous prisons. The first was from Aomori Prison near his hometown, where he was imprisoned in 1933 on a robbery and murder charge. Life inside Japanese prisons in those days were harsh, as the system focused solely on punishing prisoners and made no attempt at reforming them. For prisoners, brutal beatings and sadistic punishments by the guards for the smallest infractions were an everyday occurrence. Shiratori quickly grew to hate the unfairness of the whole prison system, and 3 years later, on a particularly stormy night, he managed to escape by picking his cell door with a piece of wire he had gotten off a wooden water bucket. He then arranged several floorboards to give the impression to the guards that he was still laying in his bed. Shiratori was on the run for a whole 3 days before he was recaptured. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for escaping and stealing supplies from a hospital. Then, in 1942, during World War II, he was transferred to Akita Prison and placed in solitary confinement for extended periods of time. More brutal torture by the guards continued. The regular torture was so harsh, in fact, that in one instance he was nearly beaten to death by the guards. Shiratori kept it a secret that he could get out of his handcuffs and that he was an excellent climber from the guards. While in the confined space of solitary confinement, he noticed the vent in the ceiling was rotting away. Every night he would roll up a futon and scale the walls to weaken the rotting wooden frame holding the vent, and return to the floor when the guards checked up on him. One night, using a storm to disguise the noise and after removing his handcuffs, he managed to escape by climbing up his tall cell wall one last time to loosen the air vent for good and climb out of it. Though within a few months he was recaptured. He had gone to the home of a guard from the prison who was kind to him, whom he trusted. Shiratori was seeking fairness to the harsh treatment from the other guards during his time in prison. He was fed and given shelter, but while in the bathroom, the guard consequently turned him in to the authorities. As punishment, he was transferred to the isolated prison at Abashiri in Hokkaido Prefecture in the north of the country, where the worst prisoners were held, and 3 years were added to his sentence of life imprisonment. The conditions of Hokkaido gave the prison a fearsome reputation. Even if an inmate escaped, he faced certain death due to its remote location, the cold freezing temperatures, wild predators like the higuma bear, and the difficulty in getting food and other resources. In the prison, convicts would sleep on an uncomfortable wooden bed and were awoken by the guards by a bang of the stick against the log pillow. In these extreme conditions, the convicts in Abashiri Prison were put on exhausting labor-intensive projects such as roadwork, construction, farming, and mining. In this situation, Shiratori was placed in more sophisticated handcuffs made specially for him after his previous escape. The next 2 years must have gone by very slowly for Shiratori, especially as he knew if he didn't do something about it, he would be spending the rest of his life in prison. Then, in the summer of 1944, his behavior started to become a little strange. He had been placed in solitary confinement due to his previous escape attempts, and was now being fed in his cell. Every morning, he would spit his prison breakfast of miso soup all over the metal doorframe of his cell, especially at the food tray slot in the door. He also dabbed some on his handcuffs and leg cuffs. Perhaps this odd behavior went unnoticed by the prison guards, Or maybe they thought Shiratori did not care for the traditional miso soup of fermented soybeans with salt and koji fungus that he was being served every day. But it was all a part of a clever escape plan by Shiratori, as miso soup has a high concentration of salt in it. So as the weeks went by, this salt had slowly weakened and corroded the metal screws and bolts in the slot in the cell door where the guards would put his food tray every mealtime. Salt reacts violently with iron. This is because the combination breaks up the oxygen molecules, resulting in accelerated rusting, causing the iron to lose electrons and the oxygen to gain electrons. So by the night of August 26th, the screws and bolts in his handcuffs and leg cuffs and the edges of the iron door feeding slot to his cell had started to become warped. So Shiratori later that evening took advantage of the now strictly enforced blackout and made his escape. He stripped down to his underwear and squeezed himself through the feeding slot, but he had to dislocate both shoulders to do so. He managed to stay on the run, living in the wilderness and hunting for food for the next 2 years. He was now aware that the war was over and headed to Sapporo. Here he was recaptured after he had a scuffle with a farmer over some food that ended with the man being stabbed and killed by Shiratori. Shiratori claimed it had been an accident and he had simply been trying to defend himself. But the court found him guilty of murder and his life sentence was changed to the death penalty. At this time, the Japanese authorities were taking no chances and sent him off to Sapporo High Security Prison. There, while awaiting execution, he was placed in a specially designed cell with reinforced walls and a reinforced door, along with 6 armed guards who were assigned to watch over him, and now he was under constant surveillance 24 hours a day. The days went by slowly for him as he waited for his death penalty to be carried out, and by 1947, the guards had become complacent, convinced the cell holding him was truly escape-proof. This lax security allowed Shiratori to make his 4th prison break. He had unlocked the bolts of his cell's floorboards, removed some of them, and over the months, dug a tunnel under the prison to freedom using his food bowl. The following year, Shiratori decided he didn't want to live his life on the run and took the brave step and handed himself over to the police. Luckily, the court recognized in all 4 of his prison escapes and recaptures, he never once used violence in any way. So they changed his death sentence to 20 years imprisonment. They also acceded to his request to be imprisoned in Tokyo. He became a model prisoner in Fuchu prison, and 14 years later in 1961, he was given parole and released. Shiratori never went back to crime. He briefly reunited with his daughter in Aomori Prefecture, and thereafter traveled the country in search of work, mostly in the construction industry. He died of a heart attack in 1979 at the age of 72. And today, part of the prison is a museum dedicated to the history of this correctional facility and contains a display showing how Shiratori escaped back in 1944, an enduring memory of a man who could not be contained. Britain's most violent prisoner. The 20th century. Charles Bronson was born Michael Gordon Peterson on December 6, 1952, in the town of Luton, Bedfordshire, England, to Era and Joe Peterson. He was also one of 3 brothers and was from a respectable family. By all accounts, he was a nice and likable child, but as he grew up and became a teenager, he started to get more and more into trouble. During his school years, he was constantly playing truant, preferring a life of petty crime. But more worryingly, a nasty streak started to emerge in him as he enjoyed more and more getting into violent fights. After Peterson left school, he had trouble holding down steady employment. He ended up doing a number of different jobs over the next few years, including working in a supermarket where he attacked his manager, on building sites, in various factories, and even as a furniture remover. But none of these jobs lasted very long, and more often than not, he was quickly fired for his abrupt manner and fierce temper. The only thing Peterson seemed to have an affinity for was crime. In the 3 years after he left school, he got into trouble for a variety of things, like smashing up parked cars after an argument with his girlfriend's father, crashing a stolen lorry, and being involved in a smash-and-grab raid. But luckily for him, each time he was only fined and given probation. Then it seemed that he may well had learned his lesson and grown out of this rebellious and self-destructive stage, for in 1971, at the age of 19, he met Irene Kelsey. They fell quickly in love and married the following year. Shortly afterwards, they were blessed by the birth of a baby boy. But soon he was back to his old ways, and in 1974 he was convicted of the serious crime of armed robbery and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. During this time, Irene divorced him, and his incarceration turned out to be a lot longer than the original sentence, as he earned an extra 6 years for repeatedly attacking prison guards and fellow prisoners, often with broken glass bottles, as well as for damaging prison property. He was seen as such a dangerous inmate that he had to spend long stretches of time in solitary confinement, and at times he had to be sedated or kept in chains as he was so unstable and violent. Peterson ended up in a high-security psychiatric ward. His behavior then became even more erratic, and he staged several rooftop protests as well as a short-lived hunger strike. When he was finally released in 1987 after 13 years in prison, he embarked on a short-lived career as an illegal bare-knuckle boxer in the East End of London. He adopted the stage name of Charles Bronson, who was a famous American actor in the 1960s and 70s, who often played tough law enforcement officers or moralistic vengeful vigilantes. Just a year later, he robbed a jewelry shop, surprising his girlfriend with a ring and selling off the rest. Charged under his fighting name, Charles Bronson, he gave up his old name of Peterson. After 69 days of freedom, he was back in custody, convicted of armed robbery for robbing a jewelry shop, and was sentenced to another 7 years in prison. Once again, Bronson was far from being a model prisoner. He continued to attack prison guards and fellow prisoners, so much so that he had to be moved numerous times, and his reputation became so bad that one prison in Bedford refused to have him. By attacking others, he was not only adding to his sentence, but also earning transfers between prisons. Subsequently, because of his antisocial behavior, he again spent a considerable amount of time in solitary confinement. Surprisingly, he only served 4 years of his sentence and was released from prison in 1992. In a few months, he was back inside again, accused of planning a robbery, though the charges were eventually dropped. But he was found guilty of assault for breaking the nose of the boyfriend of an ex-girlfriend. And despite his criminal and violent past, he escaped prison time and was given a £600 fine. You would have thought that Bronson might have tried to control his anger issues, but just 16 days later, he was again arrested. This was for planning another robbery and for illegally possessing a sawn-off shotgun, a very serious crime in Britain, which has some of the toughest anti-gun laws in the world. While he was on remand, he did not help the situation by taking a librarian hostage, demanding among things a helicopter, an inflatable doll, and a cup of tea. Bronson was disgusted at the hostage when he farted in front of him, so he released him. The situation was then diffused by the police negotiators, who never gave him his helicopter. There is no record if the police gave in to his demands for a cup of tea. At his trial, Bronson was found guilty for possessing a shotgun and was given an 8-year sentence in 1993. His behavior was now getting totally out of hand, and in 1994 he took the deputy governor of Hull Prison hostage for 4 hours. Then the following year he attacked the governor of Highdown Prison in North Surrey. It didn't stop there. In 1996, while in Birmingham Prison, he took a doctor hostage, which luckily ended peacefully. Later that year, he took 3 fellow prisoners hostage and made more colorful demands, like asking for a plane to take him to Libya, as well as an Uzi submachine gun, 5,000 rounds of ammunition, and an axe. He also demanded ice cream and slashed himself with a razor before surrendering. A further 5 years was added to his sentence for these offenses. But Bronson's disruptive behavior kept on continuing. In 1999, he took a civilian education officer hostage for 44 hours and went on a rampage because he criticized one of his drawings. He wrecked part of the prison, damaging fridges, washing machines, and furniture as he did so. Finally, the authorities had no choice but to give Bronson a life sentence, as he was obviously a habitual and violent criminal. They could see he was beyond rehabilitation and forever a danger to the public and himself. The sad truth of the matter was that in the last 25 years, he was only out of prison for a grand total of 6 months. Because he was such a difficult prisoner, they were forced to build a special high-security unit at Woodhill Prison to house him and other ultra-violent prisoners. But finally, things did seem to change in Bronson for the good when he married a mother-of-one Bangladeshi divorcee who had only just started to visit him. Bronson converted to his new wife's faith, and for a time Bronson started to call himself Charles Ali Ahmed. He seemed for a while much more stable, and it looked like married life had a calming effect on him. But in 2005, after 4 years of marriage, the couple divorced, and he renounced his faith. By 2007, he was back to his old ways, and prison guards narrowly avoided yet another hostage situation. Several times Bronson appealed against his life sentence, as well as requesting parole, but he was refused every time. In 2013, he even appealed to British Prime Minister David Cameron to be released, backed up by a petition of 10,000 signatures supporting this request. However, this request was point-blankly denied. Then in 2014, Bronson legally changed his name to Charles Salvador in honor of one of his great idols, Salvador Dali, the Spanish surrealist painter. With Bronson's reputation for violent and destructive outbursts spanning over 4 decades, he may never be released from prison. His reputation for being the most notorious and violent prisoner in Britain is well-deserved, but what made him that way? Psychiatrists can't seem to agree what is actually wrong with him. It may well be that he is simply a man with a lot of anger management issues, for Bronson has said on many occasions he has a short, violent temper that he finds hard to control. Behind his violent exterior is someone who is well-read and said to be highly intelligent. Bronson is a talented artist, an award-winning poet, and a published author of a variety of books. He's also a fitness fanatic. And maybe he has finally calmed down, as recently, when much to his disgust, his prison served croquettes instead of chips at lunchtime. Rather than hold a person hostage or attack someone, he instead filed a strongly worded formal written complaint to the prison authorities.
15 improvised weapons inmates built in prison. Any prison show watcher will tell you that inmates can get very creative when it comes to life on the inside. Prisoners use many tactics to survive, including brewing their own moonshine, forming unlikely friendships, and of course creating weapons, either for protection or for their own murderous agendas. There are plenty of weird and creative weapons made by prisoners across the world. Let's take a look at the top 15 craziest prison weapons you won't believe really exist. Number 1. The Shiv. Let's start with the most obvious and prominent prison weapon, the Shiv, or shank. Shivs are makeshift knives created from everyday materials that many inmates carry to protect themselves from their fellow prisoners. The features of a shiv generally change from prisoner to prisoner, with many different items used in innovative ways to create these deadly weapons. In the 1950s, British criminal Billy Hill offered an account of how he used his shiv. I was always careful to draw my knife down on the face, never across or upwards, always down, so that if the knife slips, you don't cut an artery. After all, shivving is shivving, but cutting an artery is usually murder. Only mugs do murder. The most common shivs are made from sharpened comb handles, shards of glass wrapped in cloth, or a razor blade tied to the end of a toothbrush. But if, for whatever reason, prisoners can't exploit these designs, they get creative. In Wolfenbüttel Prison, Germany, around 1994, a shiv was discovered inside a hollowed-out cross owned by a religious inmate. His intentions, it seemed, were far from saintly. Also worth noting is the bizarre circumstance surrounding the Hard Sweets Jolly Ranchers. These American candies are now banned from multiple prison commissaries after it was discovered that inmates had melted down the sweets and reshaped them with a cold, jagged tip that could very effectively stab someone. Number 2. Boiling water, sugar, and chocolate. This harmful process is commonly known as jugging or the sugar bomb. If you combine boiling water with sugar, it creates what prisoners call napalm. Named after the real gelatin substance, the prison-style mixture forms a paste that clumps and clings to the victim's skin, burning them horribly. One recent use of this popular prison weapon occurred in 2016, when inmate Paul McManus poured the mixture over fellow inmate Robert Wallace's head. The victim was reported to have shouted, "I can't see," as the mixture burned him. Another similar method of jugging involved melting down chocolate bars and throwing the boiling chocolate over other prisoners, which, like boiling water and sugar, hardened and stuck to them as it burned. Number 3. Chili bombs. In the UK, the fear of sugar bombs has now been taken over by the fear of chili bombs in prisons. Inmates would buy chili from the prison canteen and crush it in hot water or vinegar before spraying it in the eyes of their victims. The effect is like being pepper sprayed and, in extreme situations, can result in blindness. Number 4. Homemade bomb. Around Halloween 1995, an Illinois prison inmate named Peter Saunders went as far as to mail a homemade detonation device to Judge Blanche Manning after becoming enraged that she had dismissed a civil lawsuit against prison officials. Saunders created the explosive device by rigging a hollowed-out book using a battery, electrical wires, and a marker pen packed with sulfur from ground-up matches. The bomb almost made it onto the judge's desk before it was discovered. Somehow, it had managed to pass through several security checks, including a prison X-ray machine, before being finally noticed in a second X-ray machine in the building where the judge resided. Saunders' public defender claimed that the package wouldn't have caused any damage if it had ignited and was just a cry for attention. Number 5. Can lids. When you open a tin of something, you usually end up with a jagged-edged lid, which can be so sharp they're often used to cut food in prison kitchens, as the inmates aren't permitted to use knives. Of course, these are often stolen and smuggled into the prisoners' cells, as they make for handy little weapons that can slice quite deeply in a fight. Number 6. The Millwall Brick. The Millwall Brick was named after the violent fans of Millwall Football Club. In the 1960s and 70s, UK football games were rife with hooligans and notorious for the extreme fights that broke out between the team's two opposing fan bases. Things eventually got so bad that anything remotely resembling a weapon was confiscated before fans could enter the pitch grounds. So the more enterprising footy hooligans created a weapon that became a favorite of prisoners in the UK, the Millwall Brick. The Millwall Brick is a simple, common weapon made with just newspaper, which is easily accessible to all prisoners. They would tightly roll the paper before wetting it under their cell sink. This would be repeated until you had a hard, solid knot of paper that had as much whack to it as a wooden club. Number 7. The Homemade Shotgun. Peter Strudinger really didn't like life in prison. So much so, he attempted to escape twice using deadly weapons that were created from your common everyday items. Notably, during his first escape attempt in 1984 in Celle, Germany, Strudinger and an accomplice escaped using a shotgun made from the iron in their bedposts, pieces of lead from curtain tape, batteries, a broken light bulb, and the heads of matches. Despite his ingenious efforts, however, Strudinger was recaptured a day later in Bremen. Number 8. Zip guns. Homemade shotguns aren't the only guns found in prisons. Homemade zip guns and other small pistols are popular creations of inmates. Most of these zip guns are created using electrical wires, a nail, rubber bands, and matchstick heads with small bits of hoarded lead being used for bullets. A lot of them look nothing like the guns we know. They're small and are kept in separate pieces, only being assembled when needed. Number 9. Nunchucks. In 2011, intrepid prisoner Lorenzo Pollard escaped St. Louis workhouse using nunchucks he'd made from a length of bedsheet and 2 chair legs. Unbelievably, Pollard kept over a dozen guards at bay by swinging the weapon wildly until he smashed a window using one of the chair legs, scaled 2 razor wire fences, and ran off into the sunset. Until a few hours later, when he was picked up and returned to his jail cell. Number 10. Anime weapons. Another case from 2011. This time, in a prison in Monmouthshire, Wales, guards were astonished to find a whole host of replica anime weapons created by an inventive prisoner with a particular fondness for the Final Fantasy series. The anime-loving inmate had painstakingly used hundreds of toothpicks to create at least 6 of these weapons. Although they were discovered before they were used, the prison's governor, Steve Cross, said they presented a genuine threat, as they had been sharpened to points that could cause serious injury. Number 11. Coffee creamer. Coffee creamer is now banned from a lot of prison commissaries after one too many inmates discovered another use for it as part of a flamethrower. It turns out that a lot of powdered coffee creamers contain animal fat, which can be lit on fire and channeled through a bit of tube to create a flamethrower effect. One assistant warden of a Texas prison once said the inmates would roll up a piece of paper, place some coffee mate in it, put a cigarette lighter in front of it, blow it out, and it's just like a flamethrower. Prisoners could also toss a handful in the air before whipping out their lighter to create a fireball effect that could easily scorch someone passing by. Number 12. Dental floss. Dental floss is yet another item that a lot of prison commissaries have banned, as well as being used in many escape attempts. Due to its tensile strength, it can also make an effective weapon to choke out another prisoner or guard, or used as the hand grip on a shank. Number 13. A knuckle duster. This one is considered particularly creative. Around 1993, a guard in a German prison uncovered a dangerous homemade rasp knuckle duster in an inmate's cell. The inmate had stolen the rasp tool from the prison's machine workshop and, using material ripped from their bed as padding, arched the rasp in such a way that it formed an effective knuckle duster. Being on the receiving end of a punch made from it could, no doubt, do some serious damage. Number 14. Gardening glove. Even gardening gloves can be used to form dangerous weapons. Because secretly modified gloves look just like the ordinary ones, prisoners could carry them around without drawing much attention to themselves. Prisoners would sew one glove inside the other, but would line the inside glove with tacks or any other small, sharp-pointed object. The spiked lining would then easily penetrate the top layer, seriously hurting anyone on the receiving end of a punch or blow. Number 15. Toothbrush crossbow. Last but not least, we have the toothbrush crossbow. The toothbrush crossbow is one of the most inventive and complicated prison-made weapons in history. Created in 1998, it so impressed the prison guards that found it that they later put it on display in Canada's Penitentiary Museum, where it can still be viewed today. A prisoner at Stony Mountain Institute, Canada, was stuck in solitary confinement when he came up with a creative and deadly use of his time. Using a small list of everyday items, including 10 toothbrushes, a lighter, part of a ballpoint pen, a small piece of wire, some cafeteria tongs, yellow gloves, assorted electrical wires, a Kleenex, and a few screws, he managed to fashion what was effectively a fully functional crossbow. He created bolts for it using aluminum foil, tightly rolled paper, and Q-tips. Although the prisoner never got a chance to use his new creation, the prison guard that confiscated it had a go at the impressive weapon and reported that it could fire up to 40 feet. Imagine the chaos that would cause in the prison yard.
The convicts who escaped Alcatraz using dummy heads. There are some prisons so dark, so terrifying, they look like they've come straight out of a horror movie. One of the most infamous of these is situated in San Francisco Bay, a mile off the coastline on its own little island. designed to securely incarcerate the most dangerous men convicted in the USA and ensure they had no chance of ever escaping. The name of the prison was Alcatraz. Initially used as a military prison from the late 1850s to 1933, Alcatraz then became a federal institution from 1934 up to its closure in 1963. The island was the perfect location to house some of America's most notorious criminals and masterminds, being surrounded by the extremely cold Pacific Ocean, swirling strong currents, and even the occasional shark. During its use as a federal prison, some of Alcatraz's most famous residents included Alvin Creepy Karpis, the original Public Enemy #1, the deranged and deeply violent Birdman of Alcatraz, murderer Robert Stroud, who incidentally was not allowed to keep any birds in his cell on Alcatraz as punishment for being caught distilling alcohol at his previous prison. And of course, the most infamous of them all, the tax-dodging gangster, Al Capone. But the inmates who escaped from Alcatraz, the only men to ever succeed and make it off the island, were none of these. Instead, it was a comparatively small-time career criminal named Frank Morris and two bank robber brothers, John and Clarence Anglin, who etched their names in history as the prison's only ever escapees, with a fourth collaborator, Alan West, failing in his part of the attempt. Who were Frank Morris, Alan West, and the Anglin brothers? Frank Morris was a small-time crook with a troubled past. Raised in numerous foster homes, his first conviction was when he was just 13, and he continued to have issues with the law right up until he was sentenced to a 14-year stint in a prison in Louisiana for bank robbery. But in a move that foreshadowed his future, Morris successfully broke out of the prison and spent a year on the run before being caught and sentenced to Alcatraz as punishment in January 1960. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, were in cells next to Morris and were serving out their 10- and 15-year-long sentences respectively when they, Morris and West, began to plan their escape. The two brothers, who were born almost exactly a year apart, were bank robbers, and prolific ones at that, having targeted multiple banks and businesses before their luck ran out at the Columbia Savings Bank building in Columbia, Arizona, and they, along with a third brother Alfred, were captured and sentenced to long periods in prison. But despite their long criminal history, the brothers were never violent. They robbed places at night when there was no one there and no potential for anyone getting hurt, claiming they only ever used a weapon once, and it was a toy gun they brandished, not the most effective of firearms. After repeated escape attempts from both John and Clarence, they were each sent to Alcatraz, John in October 1960, with Clarence following shortly after in January 1961. Then, in another cell adjacent to the brothers and Morris, there was Alan West, a car thief and another habitual offender who had found himself sent to Alcatraz after a failed escape attempt from his prison cell in Florida. Together, these four men plotted their escape attempt from Alcatraz and very nearly fully succeeded. Some may say it was sheer chance that these four men ended up in cells so close together. They were all career criminals who already knew each other from previous incarcerations, had all attempted or successfully escaped prison previously, and all of whom were willing to try again. According to federal official records, Morris was exceptionally intelligent, with an IQ of 133, which was higher than 98% of the population, so with him as the mastermind, the four men stood a strong chance of succeeding. The preparations. From the beginning of December 1961, this ragtag team of criminals planned their escape, with Morris at the helm. Over the course of the next 6 months, they slowly and methodically worked through their plan. For their first step, each man would smuggle spoons from the prison dining hall and pilfer discarded saw blades so they could painstakingly dig and widen the ventilation ducts beneath their sinks in their cells. To hide their activities by day, the prisoners covered up the hole with some convincingly painted fake vents made from cardboard, and by night Morris would play the accordion to drown out the sounds of the other men slowly scraping their way to freedom. Once they made it into the air ducts, the men sent up a secret makeshift workshop on a vacant top level of the cell block, where they could really start getting to work on their escape plan. They made 4 dummy heads out of paper mache and cleverly painted their own facial features onto them with the eyes shut. Each night, the men would leave their beds, which were padded out with clothing beneath the blankets, and with the dummy papier-mâché heads just showing, so as not to arouse the guards' suspicions while they worked. They continued stealthily pilfering materials, including 50 raincoats that they fashioned into life preservers based on designs that they had seen in Popular Mechanics, a magazine that was allowed in prison, and scraps of wood and screws to build some paddles. Incredibly, they also managed to create the most necessary item for their escape, a fairly hefty rubber raft measuring 6 by 14 feet, with seams stitched by hand and sealed using heat coming off the steam pipes nearby, another idea copied from prison magazines. Finally, they were ready. The escape attempt. On June 11, 1962, the men seized the opportunity to escape. Just after lights out, Morris and the Anglin brothers met above the cell block as always, but Allen was nowhere to be seen. The cement he had used around the crumbling wall of his fake air vent had unexpectedly set solid, trapping him in his cell. He went back to sleep. Morris and the Anglin brothers carried on with the plan. The first step was breaking out onto the prison roof. It was the only sound they made during their attempt, and the guards barely stirred. The three men, carrying all their equipment, climbed down a 50-foot drain pipe and then scaled a 12-foot-high barbed wire fence before running to the northeast shoreline, hidden securely from the patrolling guards and searchlights. From there, they inflated their raft using makeshift bellows and took to the rough seas, never to be seen again, literally. The next day, when the guards finally realized they were missing, a huge sea, land, and air search commenced. Over the next 10 days, the coast was scoured for any sign of the three men, but all that turned up was some evidence of their escape, a paddle found by a Coast Guard cutter on June 14th, and nearby a wallet wrapped in plastic that looked like it belonged to one of the Anglin brothers. Remnants of what looked like the raft were discovered near the Golden Gate Bridge on June 21st. And finally, the next day, a deflated life jacket was found just off the shores of Alcatraz. The FBI's final report on the case gave no further evidence or information on the missing men, but surmised they must have drowned in their escape attempt. Ever since, there have been alleged sightings of the men and odd reports across the United States and other parts of the world. The Anglin family said that they received postcards and messages occasionally, and their mother received flowers anonymously every Mother's Day. But perhaps the most interesting was a letter sent to the FBI in 2013 after being received by the San Francisco Police Department and was later disclosed to the general public in 2018, allegedly written by John Anglin. Within it contained information on where his conspirators were allegedly buried, and he was negotiating his surrender in exchange for cancer treatment. But whether any of these strange sightings and mysterious letters were genuine is unlikely and inconclusive. It was extremely improbable that Morris and the Anglin brothers successfully negotiated the dark and dangerous waters of Alcatraz Island to make it to the other side. And if they did, there's no evidence or traces of their movements since then. It's more likely that these reported sightings and strange occurrences are the work of malicious individuals and pranksters, taking pleasure in the continual mystery surrounding their escape. Still, it's entirely possible that Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin actually did escape and have cloaked their movements ever since. If that were true, they would be the only ones to have ever succeeded in making their way through Alcatraz's deadly waters. Insane prison escapes of the 20th and 21st centuries. Whether it's Shawshank Redemption style or Clint Eastwood in Escape from Alcatraz, there are inventive and insane ways people have tried to escape from prison. The fear of a life behind bars can drive people to do crazy things, and in this video, we'll be looking at 5 of the most bonkers escape attempts from the 20th and 21st centuries. Victor Folk Nelson. Victor Folk Nelson was an impulsive and troubled young man, having been brought up poor and largely in an orphanage. His first arrest was at age 18 for larceny. He spent the next 2 years in and out of a naval jail before receiving a dishonorable discharge and beginning a life of robbery and more larceny. At age 22, Victor Nelson found himself once again locked up, this time in Charlestown State Prison in Massachusetts. Fed up with spending his life behind bars, he began to plan his escape. First, he altered the shoes given to him as part of his prison uniform, removing the heavy, thick bases and replacing them with homemade felt soles. Then, on the night of May 11, 1921, after evening school, when he and 12 other prisoners were being marched back to their cells, he saw his chance to escape. Breaking from the line, he dodged a tackle from a nearby guard, evaded multiple gunshots, and channeling his inner Spider-Man, jumped and caught onto some window bars before scaling the 40-foot-high wall. Once at the top, he used hitherto unknown parkour skills to throw himself across a massive 10-foot gap to the outer wall, where he grabbed hold of the edge of a building, using his elbows to push himself up and ungracefully fall 30 feet down to the other side to freedom. Nelson spent the next 10 days chilling around Boston and even taking part in a game of scrub baseball before heading to Ohio. He remained at large until August, when he turned himself in after hearing Thomas Mott Osborne, a prison administrator, give a speech on prison reform. Inspired, Nelson decided to give The Right Track a try. Choi Gap-bok. Choi Gap-bok earned the nickname the Korean Houdini with his jailbreak attempt back in 2012. Gap-bok had been arrested on September 12th of the same year under suspicion of robbery and was being held in a cell at a police station in the city of Daegu, South Korea. The 50-year-old's previous detentions had totaled 23 years and included crimes of leading a theft ring. Within a few days, Gap-bok decided he had enough of this being incarcerated nonsense. He covered his bed with pillows and a blanket, so it looked like he was still sleeping before attempting his escape. Using his master yoga skills and flexibility that would make a Cirque du Soleil performer jealous, Choi Gap-bok shimmied his way out of his cell by slithering through the food slot. These food slots are tiny, at just 5.9 inches tall and 17.7 inches wide. Yet Gap-bok used his powers of contortion to make his escape through the hole in just 34 seconds, while guards slept meters away. The police caught up to him 6 days later after an intense manhunt through the mountains that involved helicopters, 8 sniffer dogs, and hundreds of officers. Leaving apologetic notes to farmers he had stolen food from also didn't help. The Cowra Breakout. During World War II, over 1,000 Japanese prisoners of war were taken to Camp 12 near Cowra in the Australian Central West. This was of great shame to the Japanese, who were taught to choose honorable death on the battlefield over capture and imprisonment. Although many Japanese POWs initially settled in playing baseball and staging plays, in 1944 more war-hardened and radical inmates were arriving. Bearing news of Japan's losses in the Philippines and Saipan, tensions with their camp authorities were exacerbated, and so an escape attempt was formed. Now known as the Cowra Breakout, it was the largest escape attempt in military history, and the bloodiest. Unlike the others in this video, guards knew about the attempt in advance, having been tipped off by a prisoner a few months earlier. But rather than do anything about it, like search for hidden weapons or post extra guards, the major of the camp roundly declared the whole thing bloody nonsense, kept calm, and carried on. Except for installing 2 machine guns pointing directly at the Japanese camp. Then, at 2 a.m. August 5, 1944, all hell broke loose. Japanese prisoners suddenly appeared all across the yard in pre-planned groups. Fires broke out across the huts and tailor's shop until they were out of control. Wielding blankets to protect themselves from barbed wire, over 900 prisoners of war made a break for it all at once. For a time, it was 2 soldiers and a machine gun against 1,000 Japanese. Despite successfully killing dozens as they ran, the soldiers at the guns soon found themselves overwhelmed and were stabbed and clubbed to death as the Japanese stampeded their way towards freedom. After a night of chaos and carnage, 4 Australians and 231 Japanese prisoners had been shot, stabbed, or burned in the huts, and a further 108 were wounded. Of the 1,104 in Camp 12, over 300 successfully escaped, although not for long. Dozens of the dead POWs had either hung themselves or cut their own throats. Within 9 days, all 334 of the POWs who survived the escape had been recaptured. The Cowra Breakout became one of the biggest cover-ups of World War II, with the truth and the scale of the escape attempt only being fully uncovered decades later. Ted Bundy. One of the most infamous people in this video is the silver-tongued serial killer Ted Bundy. Long known for his charisma, charm, and intellect, Ted Bundy was the horror story of the 1970s, tracking down and killing at least 30 women, all while evading police notice, simply through his good looks and winning personality. Even when in jail, he continued to have admirers, both female and male. He even got married in 1980 to a Miss Carol Ann Boone, who apparently didn't care that he spent his free time tricking women into his car to murder. Ted Bundy actually escaped police custody twice, but it was the first time he did so that was the most unbelievable. His escape involved no tricks, no weapons, simply the power of persuasion. After being arrested in 1977, Ted Bundy chose to appear in court as his own attorney. Sent from Garfield County Jail for a preliminary hearing in Aspen, the judge was persuaded by Bundy to have his handcuffs and leg shackles removed. During a recess, he asked to visit the court's library to continue working on his case, despite being a potential serial killer. Ted was described by the guards as friendly and personable, and ultimately a likable fella. Using his gentle demeanor and wit, he convinced the guards to allow him to enter the library uncuffed and unchaperoned. In a move anyone could have seen coming, Bundy took his chance to escape. He jumped 25 feet from the library window on the second floor to the ground and promptly headed off into the Aspen Mountains. He was recaptured 6 days later, and eventually on January 24, 1989, after another escape attempt, marriage, and a child, his death sentence was finally carried out. El Chapo. Possibly the most famous Mexican drug lord of all time, El Chapo was the name given to Joaquin Guzman Loera. Whoever gave Guzman his nickname must have been brave, as El Chapo literally translates to shorty, referring to the drug lord's short stature, standing at just 5 feet 6 inches. Still currently incarcerated, El Chapo's drug empire of cocaine, methamphetamines, marijuana, and heroin led to him becoming the biggest drug smuggler and trafficker into the United States of all time, rivaling the wealth and power of the famous Pablo Escobar. El Chapo attempted to escape jail twice, but it was his second attempt in 2015 that was the most impressively insane. Last seen stepping into the shower part of his cell, the only place hidden to the security cameras, Guzman still hadn't emerged 25 minutes later, prompting guards to go and investigate and see if he really just liked the long soapy wash. What they found instead was an escape tunnel leading all the way to a housing construction site almost a mile away. This wasn't any ordinary Shawshank-style escape tunnel either. Clearly, Guzman had help from experts on the outside. A marvelously constructed large hole over 33 feet underground, the tunnel was equipped with air ducts, artificial lights, and clearly built by expert construction workers. At 5 feet 7 inches tall and 30 inches wide, it was the perfect fit for El Chapo to make his escape. When he got to the other side, there was a motorcycle there waiting, which he promptly hopped on and rode off into the sunset, until his next capture on January 8th of 2016. Penal colony punishments. Australia, 18th through the 19th century. During the late 18th century and the mid-19th century, British criminals were transported to various penal colonies in Australia. Discipline was harshly enforced by the military guards for convicts who were lazy or unruly at their jobs. Let's look at some of the punishments used on convicts. Solitary confinement. For committing minor crimes such as being disrespectful to authorities, a convict would be placed in solitary confinement in dark, dumb cells. They would be placed in a small cell that was pitch black because there were no windows to let light in. Sitting in absolute silence for weeks and fed minimal rations of bread and water, it was believed that this would give convicts time to reflect on their behavior and rehabilitate. Leg irons. Penal colonies had no restrictive walls in the early years, but only the most brave or foolish of convicts would attempt to escape. They would encounter the bush, a wilderness they could not survive. And if they did try to escape, they would be tracked by the Aboriginal tribesmen working willingly or unwillingly for the penal colony. After several escape attempts, heavy shackles were introduced to prevent runaways. They were placed around the ankles of the convict, and sometimes they were connected in a gang, as they did hard labor such as building roads, bridges, courthouses, hospitals, or working on government farms. Leg irons were extremely heavy and uncomfortable to wear, rubbing against the ankles, and were left on for months as the convict worked. Convicts placed leather between the leg iron and their ankles, if they could find it, to stop the excruciating pain. There was no key to release them either. When they were fastened to the ankle, a rivet was placed in the lock and heated up. The only way to take them off was for the blacksmith to hammer the rivet out. The treadmill. First introduced at Carter's Barracks, Sydney, in 1823 to punish insolence, the treadmill would see the convict walk on a revolving set of steps that turned a wheel. They would walk for 40 minutes, with 20 minutes rest, and could be flogged if they didn't keep up the pace. The dust created from the treadmill irritated their eyes and lungs, and if they slipped, their legs might be shredded by the blades below. The treadmill would power a mill which would grind grain into flour, therefore having the added productive element to the punishment. It would produce food for the convicts and for sale to the public. Flogging. Prisoners who were lazy, disobeyed orders, or did not do their work at all would be flogged. This brutal punishment involved a cat o' nine tails, which had lead attached to each strand, which was used to whip the convict's back. The flogging would be done publicly outside as a warning to others. Flogging itself would be done by a strong convict called scourgers, with a drummer keeping the pace. Scourgers were paid 3 shillings and 6 pence per day by the government, and were naturally unpopular with the other convicts. They slept in their own part of the barracks away from others. A doctor would also be present because of how deadly flogging was. After a couple of lashes, the skin would break. 50 lashes could turn them into a bloody mess. It could go up to 100 lashes, which could kill the convict. Another downside of flogging was that it could incapacitate the convict, making it difficult to work. This sometimes caused them to be flogged again for the same crime. The superintendent could not order this punishment. Instead, it had to be approved by the magistrate of the court or by the governor. Female punishments. For women, punishment for drunkenness or theft would see them sent to the factories, where they could be made to work for years manufacturing clothes and washing them. In the factory, being disrespectful would see them having their head shaved or placed in solitary confinement. Outside of the factories, the authorities felt free to use the same punishments that men received. Sometimes the punishments, which were excessive for the crimes committed, had the effect of changing the morality of the convict. Other times, the punishments, such as flogging, had the opposite effect, because the convict desired revenge, or the punishment made them less productive because of the severeness of the punishment.
The Hanoi Hilton, Hua Lao Prison, Hanoi, the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, around 2,500 American soldiers were reported as being prisoners of war or missing in action. When the war ended for the United States in 1973, only 591 of them returned home. The rest remained in prison camps across North and South Vietnam. The majority of American POWs were captured by the North Vietnamese Army. They spent their captivity in some of the 13 POW camps in the country. The most notorious of these was the Hua Lao Prison, located in Hanoi. It was generally referred to by its inmates as the Hanoi Hilton. Prison conditions. The prison was built by the French in the late 19th century to house political prisoners who were supporters of Vietnamese independence from their French colonial rulers. In 1954, when the French left the country, the prison was converted into a communist education center. It didn't last long, however, before Hua Lao became a prison once again when the Vietnam War started. It soon became an exclusive prison for American POWs. The first U.S. prisoner to arrive at Hua Lao was Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. He had been shot down in his Douglas A-4 Skyhawk dive bomber in August 1964 during Operation Pierce Arrow. Soon, other American POWs began arriving. Most of them were pilots who had been shot down over North Vietnam. One of the most famous inmates was a pilot named John McCain, who went on to become a U.S. Senator and a presidential candidate. He too had to eject from his A-4 Skyhawk dive bomber in 1967 when it was hit by a missile and crash-landed into Truc Bac Lake in Hanoi. He was rescued from drowning by some locals, but despite having a broken leg and 2 fractured arms caused by the ejection, he was punched and kicked by the mob, and and even had a bayonet thrust into his foot before being taken to a local military hospital for medical treatment and then transferred to the Hua Hla prison. The Hanoi Hilton was actually a prison complex in the center of Hanoi. It consisted of a number of prison wings or sectors joined together by a central courtyard. Like the prison itself, these sectors had ironic nicknames, such as New Guy Village, Heartbreak Hotel, Little Vegas, Camp Unity, and some others. Cell blocks were on the ground floor buildings with 16-inch brick walls and red tiles on the roof. Each prison building had numerous cells inside. The typical cell housed 4 prisoners and would have been large enough to house bunk beds made of wooden boards on either side of the doorway. Each bed was fitted with iron leg stocks or shackles and resembled more of a torture device than a bed. Prisoners were held behind heavy iron doors with peepholes that were used by the guards to control and intimidate the inmates. On the opposite wall, high up near the ceiling, was a barred window that had no cover. It stayed open all year round despite the weather. Each cell was illuminated with a small light bulb that was permanently left on. Most cells had no toilet or washing facilities, so the prisoners had to relieve themselves into small rusty buckets. On hot summer days, living in such conditions was unbearable. Hygiene in general was at the lowest level possible, and apart from the fact that the cells were extremely dirty, they were also infested with rats, cockroaches, mice, and other vermin. Prisoners had absolutely no opportunity to maintain personal hygiene. Weeks, sometimes months passed between them being allowed to even have a shower. Cells were not only filthy and humid, but were utterly depressing. Drawings and inscriptions scribbled by the inmates on the walls just intensified the hopelessness of life in the Hanoi Hilton. Everyday life. Hua Hla Prison earned its ironic nickname after the famous hotel chain solely for the reason of its ultimate inhospitability. The harsh conditions of the living space in prison were deemed suitable for the American POWs, as the North Vietnamese government designated them as normal criminals and treated them accordingly. There were strict camp regulations on how the prisoners should behave and what their rights and duties were. First of all, the prisoners were obliged to obey every order without question. Any attempt to refuse to answer a question resulted in severe punishment. Prisoners were even punished if they refused to eat their rations. On the other hand, prisoners had to pay the utmost respect to their guards and officers in the camp. Any talking among the prisoners was also strictly forbidden. Instead, they were welcome to enjoy regular propaganda brainwashing through box speakers. Each night, the radio program of the famous Hanoi Hannah ended with a message. GIs, why should you die thousands of miles from home? Lay down your arms now and cross over to the people's side. The food that the POWs were given was just something else that made their lives miserable. The average meal for a POW in the Hanoi Hilton was a bowl of greasy vegetable soup and a cup of rice. The only thing that ever changed was the vegetables used. It was either pumpkin, cabbage, or a strange vegetable called the sewer greens by the POWs. The diet, lacking any proper protein or energy, caused serious health problems to the prisoners. Almost all of them suffered from a vitamin deficiency and lost about 20% of their body mass. The lack of proper food was a real hardship in the winter months. With a low energy intake, the prisoners were unable to warm their bodies, and with the cell windows open all year long, many of them struggled to survive the cold. Tap code. Although communication among the prisoners was strictly forbidden, maintaining contact among themselves was still vital. It allowed them to receive information from the outside world from new inmates, learn about different interrogation tortures, and share their experiences. Most importantly, they were able to encourage each other and build a level of morale as well as a sense of unity. Despite the horrors they endured, the American POWs in the Hanoi Hilton didn't lack ingenuity. Instead of verbal communication, they designed a special tap code for passing on messages. Tap code was similar to Morse code and used a 5x5 matrix of the alphabet and was physically banged out on walls or metal doors in the cells. Letters were identified by 2 sets of taps, one for the column and the other for the row. Prisoners standardized abbreviations in order to ease communication via the tap code. There was even a simple system for encrypting messages. It was a perfect way of communication of which the North Vietnamese guards were completely unaware was going on. Torture. Life in the Hanoi Hilton was bad enough as it was, but prisoners were constantly exposed to torture. They could be tortured for several reasons: to impart information, to be forced to cooperate, or just purely for the guards' entertainment. Most tortures were held during the interrogations. The first level was psychological torture. Prisoners were exposed to isolation, starvation, sleep denial, and constant brainwashing sessions. After only a few days of such treatment, their ability to resist further interrogation decreased significantly. The American POWs usually managed to withstand this kind of torture, much to the fury of their interrogators, who would then resort to the physical torture. The basic kind of physical torture was simple but brutal, with the beating of prisoners while they were tied to stools. This was, unfortunately, only a prelude to even worse torture. The NVA guards and interrogators were quite creative in their torturing techniques. Prisoners were blindfolded and forced to run around the courtyard while being dragged along by a noose. They would then be thrown into trenches or small cages where they would spend several days in cramped positions. There were, however, two torturing methods that were considered much worse. The first was a rope trick, a torture that involved binding a prisoner's arms behind their back, which would then rotate upward until their shoulders popped out of their sockets. In this position, the prisoners were hung from meat hooks secured to the ceiling. There was a variation of this method that involved tying both hands and feet together and then binding the hands to the ankles behind the back. To make the method even worse, while hanging from the ceiling, some prisoners were often brutally beaten with sticks. The second method was the twisted cuff treatment. Prisoners had their arms tied behind their backs with handcuffs that had a ratchet attached. The cuffs were then tightened to a degree where two bones bent together as one. There were examples where both of these sadistic methods were used together. Unfortunately for the American prisoners, torture didn't stop with the interrogations. Even during their stay in the cells, POWs were exposed to abuse by having their legs placed in iron shackles at the bottom of the bed. In addition, iron pipes were installed to put pressure on the shins. Prisoners lay in such positions with their hands tied behind their back for days on end. All that time, they had to defecate where they lay, and this would attract the rats and cockroaches that would crawl all over their bodies. On top of everything, the lack of medical care after the torture was also a kind of maltreatment, especially because the guards enjoyed picking at the prisoners' wounds. The worst period for torturing was after the failed escape plan in the spring of 1969. However, it all stopped in September, the same year the Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh died. It was practically impossible for any prisoners to withstand this continuous torture and abuse, and eventually each of them reached his breaking point. The interrogators would manage to extort some kind of information or confession from them. However, prisoners had their own way of manipulating their interrogators. Many of the coerced confessions were made up and full of nonsense. One such confession came from an airman who promised to not fly any further missions against the North Vietnamese. He called himself Lieutenant Clark Kent, who was, of course, better known to the American public as Superman, the comic book hero. Life in the Hanoi Hilton prison produced extreme physical, mental, and emotional stress for its POWs. It was especially difficult for those who had spent years inside the prison. The record was held by Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr., the first American POW to come to the Hanoi Hilton. He had spent 8 years and 7 months in captivity. He was released on February 12, 1973, with the first batch of American POWs that returned home as part of Operation Homecoming. The last POW left in March 1973. In the years to follow, former prisoners shared their experiences with the American and international public with the horrors they suffered at the Hanoi Hilton. The United States government never charged the North Vietnamese for the war crimes they committed.